Hello, everybody. It's Saturday night at 10 o'clock Eastern Time. I am Chris Weave. I am here by myself, actually, tonight. Usually, when I'm here by myself, I have Lissa producing the show, but Lissa's at Gen Con, as she told us last week. And so I am literally here running everything by myself. So I apologize in advance if there's a few pieces where it's a little bit rough, because I'm not an octopus and I only have two eyes, and it's hard to do that stuff. Let me start off by pointing out what I always point out, which is that anything I say is the opinion of me, not any of my employers, past, present, or future. It's not the opinion of anybody else. And now that I've said that, let me turn off that banner because that banner is going to drive me crazy. All right, let me turn off the banner. Also, I guess I do have one co-host. You all know Buddy, of course. Buddy has been asleep for the last 2 hours. There were a couple of times where he came out and got something to eat, and I thought that maybe he was going to hang out with me a little bit, and I tried to get him to hang out with me, but then he went back and curled up and went to sleep. But of course, about 10 minutes before the show was scheduled to start, he woke up and he started pestering me for attention. So I may do this talk with Buddy sitting on my lap here. So, but Buddy's doing pretty good. So I'm going to talk about something that a lot of it's going to sound familiar. But this is a talk that I've been doing at science fiction conventions for probably better part of a decade now. Maybe even a little bit more. I'm trying to remember where I was living when I first did it. And it is a talk called What the U.S. Navy Taught Me About Starfleet. Now, this is actually the very first time that I've done this talk with slides, because originally when I did it, I was in a venue that didn't have projectors or anything. It just had a little stage, and I sat on the stage and did the talk. That venue was the Philadelphia Science Fiction Society, in Philadelphia. They're the people that run the PhilCon program, PhilCon convention, which takes place in November. And they have a speaker series, and they invited me to be their speaker in December of 2013, something, or yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I forget exactly when it was, but I remember it was December because it started snowing. I beat the snow getting out of town the next day. And what they did is they had me come down to Philadelphia, put me up in a hotel, took me out to dinner, and I gave this little talk. And so when I first asked them, I said, "What do you want me to talk about?" And they said, "Oh, whatever you want to talk about." And it's like, okay, no, can you give me any guidance on what do you want me to talk about? And they said, "Oh, just whatever you want to talk about." And it's like, okay, guys, I'm really kind of looking for ideas here. I'm looking for a little help. And so I finally started this. I decided that the right answer was to do something that, one of the things that I do is that I always say my science fiction fandom superpower is that I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. And that's because I've got a fair amount of experience going to sea with the U.S. Navy. I do a talk called Going to Sea with the U.S. Navy that I'll probably do on the show at some point. Although that's a talk that can last anywhere from, I think I once did a 3-hour version of that talk when it was on a Friday night at the con and there was nobody in the room after me and we just kept going. But I've spent a lot of time at sea. I know a fair amount about what the U.S. Navy does and how it's organized, et cetera. I was a naval analyst for a long time. And it just really seemed like it was the thing to do, is to tie all that stuff together. So I spent part of today actually turning this into a slide deck. Like I said, it's never been a slide deck before. You're going to, if you're a regular viewer of the show, you're going to recognize a lot of the stuff that you've seen it before. Some of that stuff actually started off in this talk and then migrated to some of the other talks. I had a long sort of, discussion with myself about, do I want to take that out? Most of them have seen it, et cetera, et cetera. And I decided not to do it for 3 reasons. First one is that it really is kind of essential to the talk. And I want it to be the case that somebody who isn't a regular on the show who might be visiting us for the first time gets the full up experience. So I really decided it needed to be there. The second reason I decided to go ahead and leave it in is that it's going to go up on YouTube, right? And so it's very much, I expect that there will be people that will stumble across it. And the third one is, every time I put something out like this, it's an opportunity for everybody who's watching it to comment. And I don't go back generally and look at comments on a regular basis. I need to start doing that. But what I do is I always take the chat and stick it in a text file and save it. And I, as most of you know, I frequently will respond to those comments later on. But it's always an opportunity for me to get feedback on this. And I can't give feedback if I don't do it. So I'm going to go ahead and include stuff that you've all seen before. Oh, and I guess there's a fourth thing too, which is, my guess is you'll probably be just as happy to see it yet again. I know I'm always happy to say it again, so my guess is you're probably happy to see it again. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. All right, so as I said, not the opinion of any employer, past, present, or future. I'm going to emphasize that again in just a moment. Okay, make sure the focus is in the right place so I don't accidentally shut off StreamYard. Okay, you've all seen this before, most of you, but in case you haven't, my day job is that I was a naval analyst, intelligence analyst, sort of doing both the blue and the red side of naval analysis for about 20 years. During about half that time, I've been a professional war game designer and analyst also. And so I actually started off doing that, working for the Center for Naval Analysis, started doing exercise analysis and other stuff that wasn't directly related to wargaming while I was at CNA. And then I went off and ended up working at DIA for 10 years with the Naval War College in between. And while I was at the Naval War College, I have a degree in strategy. Because that's the degree basically that the War College gives out. And so I got to do the faculty by day, student by night thing. So, and all the time when I'm doing this stuff, I'm really been thinking about, my hobby of science fiction. So I would, usually when I went to sea, when I was working for CNA, I always had 2 notebooks with me. And one of those notebooks, I'm collecting data about whatever exercise I'm there to watch. And then the other one, I brought the other one along just to write down all of the cool stuff that I saw in the 87 days of sea time that I had. And so, I tried to capture as much of that as I could. Since then, I've spent a lot of time doing sort of semi-professional science fiction work. I was one of the founding members of BU9, supporting David Weber in the Omniverse. I've been a regular producer for NavyCon. I should have deleted the Joint Geeks of Staff podcast because I decided I just didn't have enough time to do that. And I need to go back and see how things are going with them because I'm not doing the Joint Geeks of Staff. But I did do the NavyCon side of it. I produced a couple of things and I've also presented with them. And of course, I'm doing Starfleet Tactical here in the Aries Studio YouTube channel. I've been a consultant for Chuck Gannon and Tom Harlan and some other people in some of the books that they've written. In fact, in Chuck Gannon's first novel, I've been Tuckerized. There's a Lieutenant Chris Weave, who's a total and complete jerk in that book, but which is great because it means that I can give Chuck grief about it. He would always say, "Oh, no, he's really a good guy. He's really a good guy. He'll redeem himself later." It's like, yeah, you made me a jerk. I've been interviewed by the blog for the associated with the journal Foreign Policy. I did one called Aircraft Carriers in Space, which is basically a very short write-up of a presentation I've done on this channel. And then I did one called Enterprise versus Enterprise, which is kind of a version of this talk. And then I was also on the Discovery Channel's Alien Invasion, Are We Ready? And I told you the story. I'm not going to retell the story about DIA totally and completely freaking out when I did that. But I should emphasize that this talk is not the opinion of anybody but me. It's not a comprehensive discussion about these topics. I really could go on for a long, long time. Pat and I have been thinking about having a companion channel, basically, where we do more structured type presentations, things with scripts, etc., and we break stuff up into pieces, and some of it would be 20 minutes long, and there's other things would be an entire series of things. And so, I mean, I could talk about the subject for a lot longer and give a lot more examples, and I intend to at some point. And so that's just basically how it's going. And I guess the last thing I would say is that there's going to be some generalizations here and there, especially when I talk about the history section of it. So, I'm not trying to spoil anybody's fun. I'm trying to get it as accurate as I can. But, the format sort of lends itself to, there has to be some generalizations. And, oh, by the way, I see that there's a lot of chat stuff going on. That's fantastic. I may have an opportunity to look at chat and respond to a couple of specific things at the end, but don't count on it. So this might be one where I'm going to have to go through tomorrow and put some comments up. Okay, so here's a brief outline of what we're going to do. So we're pretty much done, almost done with the introduction. Then I'm going to make 4 observations. And then they're all things I've learned about the U.S. Navy. Actually, I got that backwards. It's things I've learned about Starfleet. It's not things I've learned about the U.S. Navy. I learned things about the U.S. Navy, and they illuminated things about Starfleet. So pretend I said Starfleet there. And then I'm going to have a few final comments. But before I get to that, why did I pick Star Trek to compare the U.S. Navy to? Now, I'm on a show called Starfleet Tactical. So, yeah, that's part of the reason why I'm doing it tonight. But when I give this talk at science fiction conventions, at this point, what I say is, if you haven't ever seen an episode of Star Trek, raise your hand. No hands go up. And then I say, that's why I pick Star Trek, because everybody's seen Star Trek. If you're a science fiction fan, if nothing else, if you're a science fiction fan, you watched enough Star Trek to decide that you didn't like it. But everybody's seen it. Everybody's kind of got an idea about what it's about. And so as a result of it, it's a really great touchstone to compare to. The other thing is that, there's 700 plus episodes of Star Trek out there. So there's on the one hand, there's a little bit of danger on my side because I don't have them all in my head anywhere near like the way Pat does, for instance. And so there's always this danger I'm going to forget something. I'm going to miss some particular thing. But there's just a lot of stuff there to make the comparisons. There's a lot of data, and I could spend an awful lot of time doing that. By the way, this illustration here was one that was specifically done for the Enterprise versus Enterprise article by Winchell Chung. This is Winch's work. So thank you, Winch, for that. He really helped out with that article. Okay, so I said there were 4 observations. So the first observation is that Starfleet operates in a dramatically different environment than the U.S. Navy does. And that's because, as Pat and I have talked about a lot of times, navies are a product of their environment. And there's a lot of things that science fiction often gets wrong in thinking about it, because you may recall I did about a month or so ago, I did my talk where I made the argument that most of the time in science fiction, if you've got something that looks like a navy, what they've really done is taken a real world historical thing, filed the serial numbers off, added in space on the end, and called it a space navy. But it's really not, that's really not a very good representation of what the real environment that the U.S. Navy operates in. And that you kind of have to understand that environment to understand why navies are the way that they are. And you may recall me talking about something I call the three H's: history, hiding, and hydrodynamics. And so I'm going to go through those again. Most of you have seen some of these slides, but in case you haven't, then I I hope that you get an opportunity to learn something about how navies work. So starting off with history. For the first 500 years or so, there was really two types of naval ships. There was the line of battleships, which is where the term battleship comes from. And then there was just basically scouts and auxiliaries, and the battleships are there to fight the big fleet actions, and the auxiliaries are there to do all the supporting functionality like mail delivery, scouting, courier, things like that. Now, I don't want to make it sound like those ships weren't armed and they didn't occasionally engage in combat. They did, right? In the Age of Sail, you had frigates that were fundamentally the scouts. They engaged in combat all the time. They did commerce raiding. If frigates ran into other frigates, they fought frigate actions. There are times where, they might end up in far off stations. They did stuff like that all the time. But when you massed the fleet for war, those guys usually sat out. And that's because during the time of the Age of Sail, and even beyond that, they really didn't add that much when the big boys went out to fight. They didn't have the armor or the wherewithal to stand against the big guns. In the Age of Sail, it was frequently just more guns, but they couldn't really stand up to that. They didn't contribute a whole lot. They actually made your line of battle weaker by being part of it. You were actually better off with fewer ships of a better type than to try to put them in there. And so they just sort of stood off and did auxiliary duties. So like at the Battle of Trafalgar, there's frigates there, but the frigates are standing off and they're relaying signals around the gun smoke and stuff like that. They're not really functioning as warships per se. They're not fighting. This all changes in the 20th century. You get torpedoes, you got airplanes, you got all these things coming in that lead to a total reimagining of naval war fleets into capital ships on the one hand and escorts on the other hand, right? These new platforms come along. They have torpedoes, they have airplanes, they have bombs they have ship-killing weapons, and this forces the creation of escorts. Before this point, you really had the battle line was the battle line was the battle line. Now you've got other ships that are smaller that are actually intended to fight as part of the battle line. Well, not necessarily the battle line itself, but they're intended. They have a role that involves firing weapons in a way that they didn't used to before. And that might be conducting torpedo attacks on the enemy battle line, which, as much as anything, torpedoes are ship-killing weapons, but as much as anything, that was about forcing the other guy to sub-optimize his battle line, right? The main firepower of the fleet was literally the big guns of the battleships, and they were formation dependent, and you'd want to force the other guy to sub-optimize by threatening them. And likewise, you'd want to protect your guys from being sub-optimized by the enemy. Then you get airplanes in it. Now you've got airplanes that are causing all sorts of problems, and you got to protect against airplanes. And so the end result of this is that one warfare domain ends up becoming three. You end up with all these escorts that are performing valuable functions, even in situations where the battle fleet itself, the main gun power, the capital ships, even in situations where they're capable of actually defending against this stuff, you don't want them distracted, right? This is the reason why lawyers don't type their own letters, why lawyers have secretaries, because the lawyers charge a lot more than the secretary does. And so it's sort of the same kind of thing. It's like you've got this division of labor, and the escorts, they're full participants in the battle, but they're off making sure that nobody's bothering the battleships while they're firing in the battle line. You also have in the 20s and 30s these naval treaties that led to some artificial designs. Like you look at all the 8-inch gun cruisers in World War II. Why 8 inches? Well, because it was part of a treaty. It was part of the Washington Naval Treaty that limited the size of cruiser guns to 8 inches. And so you end up with all these designs that are artificial as a result of these treaties. You would never have, you might have, you would have built 8-inch gun cruisers at some point, but then they would have gotten gradually bigger, and you would have seen ships evolve in a different way. It's also worth pointing out that not all ships are created equal. And I love this illustration because on the one hand, you see what's left of the USS Oklahoma, which was made in 1916 and was 28,000 tons, compared to the USS Wisconsin from 1944, which was twice the size of the Oklahoma. But they were both battleships. They were both in the same category. They both had the same general function. And most of, the battleships that were all sunk at Pearl Harbor, they weren't recent construction. They were all 20s and before. They were old ships. Oklahoma was about as old as it got at the time, but you had a bunch of old ships there. And as a result, they weren't, the newer ships were a lot more capable, but they're all considered battleships. Okay. So let's talk about hiding a little bit. Real world navies, real world ships hide in 4 different ways. They hide behind the curve of the Earth. They hide behind what I call the interface barrier, which is the barrier between the sea and the sky. They hide through the use of distance and space. Space is big. The oceans are big. You can, if you've got a very tiny field of view sensors, then it's hard to do that scan. And they hide through the use of low observable features, which are stealth. Now, stealth is not about making you invisible. Stealth does not make you invisible. Stealth is really about signal to noise ratios. It's about understanding your environment. It's about fitting in with your environment. It's about forcing the other guy to make a decision between false positives and false negatives. The closer you get to the background, the more you force him into the situation of making a decision, having to decide between false positives and false negatives. Give me the controls of a radar. I can find the stealth airplane. I can adjust the sensitivity to such that it'll find the stealth airplane every time. And I'll say, hey, look, the stealth airplane is one of those 10,000 hits on the radar screen. It's assuming you got a really good computer. Most radars probably couldn't handle 10,000 hits. They couldn't track them very well. And so that's really how stealth works. Now, below we have an illustration of what I mean by the curve of the Earth and stuff like that. So you've got these, ship A can't see ship B because of the curve of the Earth. The airplane has a hard time seeing the submarine because there's the interface barrier in the way. And as a general rule, the way that you deal with that, if you're an airplane, you drop sonobuoys into the water. And they have a hydrophone so you can get through that interface barrier. If you are a submarine, you stick a periscope up so you can, which might have a radar on it. You can do visual or you can do radar that way. But as a general rule, sensors that work in one medium do not work in other mediums, right? Radar doesn't penetrate below the seas. Sonar generally can't hear stuff above the water. Although I was on the bridge wing of a destroyer one time, and because of the way they had their sonar set up and the direction the beam was pointing, I'm standing on the bridge wing and I could actually hear the sonar coming up. But it doesn't cross that barrier very easily. In fact, there's even barriers in the ocean itself. There's something called the layer. And the layer is the difference between the turbulent, relatively warm water up top and the colder water down, less turbulent water down below. And it's a pretty clear line. There's not a whole lot of mixing unless a storm has come through. And the firmer that layer is, the more defined that layer is, the less sound that goes across it. So you not only have this interface barrier between the sea and the sky, you have it between shallow water and deep water too. And then you start getting into the bottom composition and how deep the water is, and because sound behaves really, really weird in water. So But of these 4 different ways to hide, the first 2 don't exist in space at all. You don't have a curve of the Earth, and you don't have an interface barrier to hide behind, unless you've got some, I don't know, you can hide in hyperspace and then you can pop out or something like that, right? That's you can make any of this work the way that you want it to. That third one is really assumption dependent. It really depends upon how good your sensors are. Depends upon the field of view of your search asset. That's one of the reasons why in fact, hold on a second, I'll get to that in just a second. Geography and the environment, the nature of air and water is essential to how these craft really operate. So let's talk a little bit more about stealth. And what I was just about to say there is that it's really assumptions dependent on exactly how this stuff works, and you really need to be thinking in terms of the kill chain. And a lot of times, as I talked about previously when I talked about the ASW kill chain, the kill chain in many cases really sort of matches up with the type of sensors you've got. In the ASW kill chain in particular, there's some overlap there. But as a general rule, you've got kind of like sensors that are good at detection, but not really good at localization. And you got other or maybe not even good at tracking. And you've got other sensors that are good at that stuff. And then, the sensors get finer and finer. Anybody who's ever tried to do a search with binoculars understands exactly how hard this is. It's like looking through a toilet paper tube. And so if I got to do a full sky survey, a 360 by 360 sky survey, and I'm looking for stuff that's very, very faint out there, it can be difficult to do. So you really need to understand your environment. You really need to understand your sensors. You need to understand what kind of noise is inherent to the sensors. It's very easy to say, there's a theoretical limit there, but in theory and practice are the same, but in practice, not so much. There's a lot of things that theoretically should be detectable that aren't, because we don't have these specific sensors capable of doing that. Now, we'll talk a little bit about how this applies in Star Trek later on. So also hydrodynamics. This is one of the big things. In a lot of ways, this is actually kind of the thing that's most similar between Star Trek and how the U.S. Navy operates. And that's because in the real world, bigger ships have bigger engines, and there's this property of hydrodynamics that says the longer you are, the faster you are. If you've ever watched NASCAR, and you've watched any of the super speedways like Talladega or Michigan, you've seen the exact same thing going. Drafting is a thing, right? If you've ever done this on the freeway, don't do this on the freeway. Don't do this on the interstate. But, like you get right up behind a truck and you use less gasoline because you're drafting along, and the truck can actually go faster. And race cars do it, and ships are the same way. The longer the ship is, the faster it can go. And it uses less power proportionally to go faster in terms of like amount of fuel per ton. It uses less power to do that. And so this means that you really get to the point, this is the reason why ships have top speeds. This is the reason why you do things like you double the size of the engine and you only get an extra knot or two. And so that's really a big deal here. The equivalent in Star Trek is how, ships have a top speed because they're not accelerating in the same way that if it were a rocket, right? It's not like it's not additive. It's really closer to being the engine is revving sort of deal, and it's just like they've got friction in it because of the way that warp factors work. So hydrodynamics is actually the thing that's closest. And I would even go so far as to argue that the size argument applies there too. I am not a believer in the idea that these little ships in Star Trek are that fast. I think it's pretty consistent that bigger ships are faster ships in that universe. Holding other things constant. So. Okay, so what happens when you mix history and hydrodynamics? Well, the lesson of World War I ship design is that you can't have it all. And so you end up having this split between dreadnought battleships and dreadnought battle cruisers. So one of them optimizes for gunpowder and speed. The other one optimizes for gunpowder and armor. And because you couldn't do all of them, so you optimize. You couldn't have speed and armor and gunpowder. So you pick 2 out of the 3. The lesson of World War II ship design is you can have it all because ships have reached their hydrodynamic limit by and large. And as a result, battle cruisers really sort of that bifurcation of the design path really sort of came back together. You can make a really good argument that the Iowa class ships are battle cruisers. You can make an even better argument that the Washington class, or not the Washington class, the North Carolina class are battle cruisers, as much as they are battleships. Now, it is worth pointing out that the Brits and the Germans and the Americans all meant different things about it, and the Brits weren't consistent internally themselves, and Jackie Fisher, who was the creator of the idea, really, he gets credit for it. He wasn't consistent. Both he had a tendency to change his view over time, and he also had this tendency to say whatever he thought would work well. Whatever argument came to him when he was talking to a particular person, that's the argument he'd make. And he sometimes speculated about, we could do this, we could do that. And so it's really kind of tough to narrow down exactly what that meant by that. But that's how that all sort of fit together. This is not really the kind of universe that it's kind of the universe that looks like Star Trek. I mean, you can kind of squint at it and go, okay, yeah, I can see that. And actually, the more I think about it, the more you can see it, because when they redid the warp factor scale, and they made it so the fact that you can never reach warp 10, right? It gets harder and harder to go faster and faster. So it seems. You see ships get bigger over time. I mean, the Galaxy class is known as a particularly fast hull, and it's also a particularly big hull. And that's because when they build them to be fast, they generally build them to be big. Okay, so that sort of sets the stage for how the environment is. Let's talk about a few other observations. And the first one that I have, the observation number 2, is that Starfleet really isn't the military as we would understand it. And you see a really good comment on that in Prelude to Axanar. Garth very specifically says, we didn't sign up to be warriors. That's not what Starfleet is about. They have captains and lieutenant commanders, etc. They have shields, they have phasers, but they're not warriors. They're not there to function as a navy per se. They're there to do other things, and I would argue that they're a lot closer to being the Coast Guard. They have a force, protection of the United States mission, but they also do, the Coast Guard also does maritime safety and maritime security and maritime mobility. Maritime mobility means they maintain buoys so that you can get in and out of port safely. And you sort of look at those guys, and then you can, and they also do protection of natural resources like fisheries enforcement and anti-pollution and stuff like that. And so I look at Starfleet and I see something that looks a lot more like the Coast Guard with some other things thrown in. Specifically the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, because they really sort of do survey type work in a way that NOAA does survey type work. Looks like the National Geographic Society, which did a lot of mapping back in the 1800s. Looks like the National Science Foundation. They're funding research. They're doing research on ships all the time. And they're really functioning like the U.S. State Department does. They're making first contact. They're opening diplomatic relations. And so from that standpoint, I really strongly recommend not thinking about Starfleet in the same way that you think about, say, the U.S. Navy or the U.S. Air Force or something like that. It's really not like that. Now, you do see occasionally people that look like they're that they might be in the military. Jellicoe in Chain of Command, for instance, he's really the only Starfleet officer you see that really sort of acts like a naval officer. And it's sort of funny, the fan reaction to him, because the fan reaction is generally, man, this guy's an asshole. And if you think about it, why is he a jerk? Well, he made Troy wear a real uniform. Okay, doesn't seem too bad to me. And he also told Riker that, no, you're not going to plan a rescue mission. You're never going to get approval to run the rescue mission. You've got a full-time job that you are being paid for, even though we don't have money. You've got a full-time job running this ship, and so you are not to waste any time planning the rescue mission. You've got other things to do, and somebody else, if there's going to be a rescue mission, somebody else is going to do it. That's exactly the sort of, this is what I'm telling you to do. This is what commander's intent is. You need to pay attention to what your orders are. Sort of conversation I would expect from a U.S. naval officer. He is far and away the one that's really closest to being a military officer that I've seen in that entire show. But by and large, it's really more like the Coast Guard. So observation number 3 is that Starfleet really has it tough. Space is big. The ships are, they've got to cover a lot of area. We've seen, how many times they were the only ship in the quadrant. They got to deal everything by themselves. They're alone and unafraid and away from support most of the time, especially in the original series, right? The nearest ship there's instances where they're going out to investigate ships that were lost decades ago because they finally have a lead on it. And, it's like, why didn't anybody investigate that before? And it's because we're spread really, really thin. This is not how the U.S. Navy operates. An aircraft carrier strike group deploys. First of all, there's a bunch of ships in that strike group. And the second thing is they get regular resupply. Other ships bring them stuff. They unload the stuff, fuel, food, weapons, spare parts, whatever they need. There's even ships that are often on station by themselves. At the very least, they have to go into port every now and then, or an unwrapped ship comes out and they do an underway replenishment. They also get lots of sort of other support from shore, right? It's not like they're doing all their own meteorology. They've got meteorologists on board, but they've got an entire shore organization that exists just to make sure that ships at sea know what the weather's going to be like. You've got national sensors up there that are providing them intelligence information. You've got intelligence organizations back ashore that are feeding them stuff. So you've got the intel officer on a ship is really, as much as anything, about his job is to ask the right questions and pull the right information down. He's not an analyst per se. He's a curator of information that he's getting from the shore establishment. In addition to that, there's, you know who the adversary is. You know who the players are. You've got this thing called international law, so you know how people are supposed to react and how they probably will react to your presence. You never have this situation where you sort of wander into somebody and go, who the hell is that? What country are they from? Well, you might temporarily not know what country they are, but there are no reported instances of a U.S. carrier strike group or carrier battle group discovering a new country that was totally unknown. Even if you go back into antiquity, you always had some idea who the people were. You might not have direct contact with the guys that are on the other side of the guys that are on the other side of you. But you kind of got word, right? If you're in the Roman Empire and there's stuff coming from the Silk Road, you know that there's stuff over there and there's stuff that's making the transition to you, cloth and stuff like that, that's coming into your empire. And you may just know that it's over there someplace, but you know it's there. There's never this instance where the military is really the first to encounter somebody totally and completely new. In Star Trek, it happens every week. That's a really, really tough problem. So now, it also, with the U.S. Navy knowing who their adversary is, it means that you optimize your weapon systems against them. And some of you may recall, I talked about the particular example of Will Smith trying to shoot down these fighters. His weapon probably isn't going to lock on them, because if it's an IR seeker, an infrared seeker, the weapon's gonna look at those things and reject those as decoys. Even if they're hot, it's going to go, you can't fool me. That's not a jet engine. I know what a jet engine looks like. That's not a jet engine. And it's not going to want to lock. And a lot of what we do, how we build stuff is we know what we're going to have to go up against. And so we design stuff specifically to go up against that. And we take advantage of that stuff, but it also means that we sort of limit stuff in a way. And we make our stuff less able to cope with something we haven't thought of as a result of it. Dealing with these fighters would be a really tough deal. So Starfleet really, really has it tough. It's a hard problem for Starfleet. On the other hand, Starfleet has it easy. In that the equipment always works, right? Every now and then an ion storm comes along and knocks something offline for a little while. That was more likely to happen in the early episodes than the later. But I mean, if you think about it, there's a handful of episodes where stuff breaks, and it's a big deal because it just doesn't break. They're always running level 4 diagnostics, and you just don't, stuff doesn't break in that universe in the way that it does in our universe. In our universe, sometimes it's just kind of an unreliable piece of gear that needs a lot of maintenance, and it may be less reliable than we first thought it was going to be. Sometimes it's just a really tough problem. They get rode hard and put away wet. They get beaten on, and sometimes the gear is old, and it's just tough to keep working. Star Trek ships always seem to have perfect situational awareness. Starfleet has magic sensors. They always know what's around them as a general rule. They've got sensors that can see light years away. It's amazing what they can see. They've got an incredibly proficient crew. The worst guy that you see in any Starfleet uniform would be considered an A-list performer by anybody I know in the U.S. Navy. You'd kill to have those guys on your team, because it really is the best of the best, and they don't seem to have any motivational problems. You don't have any problems with them, falling in with payday lenders. You don't have any problems with them, marrying strippers, none of that stuff. That is just sort of what seems to end up happening in the real world. You don't have any issues where, you basically have people that are immature because they're only 19 years old and they need to do some growing up. U.S. Navy's got a lot of people like that. The average age on an aircraft carrier is about 19 or 20. And that's because you've got 4,000 to 5,000 people on that, and the vast majority are the lowest level guys are the biggest chunk of that. Also, how much training have you seen them do? You don't really see them running drills very often. I mean, when they do, it's really kind of noticeable. The U.S. Navy spends a lot of time, excuse me, U.S. Navy spends a lot of time training just to maintain proficiency and to add to the proficiency in Starfleet. They seem to be pretty much, they're all up rounds without having to do any of that stuff. They have perfect communications with everybody as a general rule. They're always able to get through. They're always able to get aligned. There doesn't really seem to be, okay, yeah, I guess every now and then they've got jamming. Every now and then there is some jamming that takes place. But as a general rule, if you're just out on patrol, unless you're actually engaged, you got pretty much perfect comms. And at least in the original series and Next Gen, the combat is really very simple. It gets complicated by the time you get to Deep Space Nine, right? You have fleet actions. You've got to do command and control. Although you don't really see them do anything that I would describe as being command and control functions. They kind of, every now and then somebody will send something out, but they don't really seem to delineate command and control responsibilities other than you're in charge, so you go lead the way, right? Whereas the U.S. Navy has an elaborate system designed to be able to break things down so it lets them detach units and they can sort of function by themselves. It lets them work when comms are down. because of jamming or because somebody's got a casualty or whatever. You know, if the aircraft carrier gets hit by a weapon and all their comms go offline, they know immediately where to do and who's in charge and all this other stuff, and it devolves quite nicely. And you've got backups for everything, etc. You don't, you know, it must be in Starfleet somewhere, but you don't really see them talking about it. And the ranges are, you know, that's one of the things that's so really funny about this is that a harpoon missile has a range far greater than a phaser does, as you see it in next gen, right? Everything is really up close. Now, if Pat was here tonight, Pat would make the argument, and it's a pretty good argument, actually, and this is what I really actually believe. Pat would make the argument that what we're seeing is everything's on compressed scales, and that you have to sort of give them some leeway that they're all putting it in so that you can actually see the various parts, and we shouldn't automatically sort of assume that they're all right on top of each other. I guess the comments I would have about that is twofold. One, I always think of this as that this is a 24th century television show, and so they're as 24th century Hollywood is as sloppy about getting it right as 21st century Hollywood is. The other thing, though, sort of against that argument is, against Pat's argument in particular, is that when you look at it, you know, there's times where they're maneuvering around stuff, right? You can maybe argue that in gaming miniature terms, the figure scale and the ground scale aren't really the same. You know, like a 1 inch tall figure, 1 inch on the map may represent 10 feet or may represent 100 feet, whereas the 1 inch tall figure, he's not 100 feet tall, right? You can have different scales there. The problem you run into, though, with Star Trek in that regard, if you try to parse it that way, is they're maneuvering around stuff all the time, right? They're putting things in, you know, getting behind barriers, etc. And you wouldn't be able to do that if there was really this discontinuity there. Now, of course, somebody's probably busy typing right now, but that's also something you see in war games, and it's true. It's true. You can have the scales can be off, but you still have terrain out there, and you're still maneuvering around it. So, you kind of on all of it, you kind of have to do a little bit of a hand wave. So now a few final thoughts. One is that whenever I do a talk like this, as I said, my superpowers, I can talk about real world navies and science fiction navies at the same time. That is my intent, is to be able to share some information that I've picked up and sort of bring it to you guys and share it with you. My intent is not to ruin anyone's fun. So please don't let anything I've said ruin anybody's fun. And if you need to just forget that you heard me say it, forget that you heard me say it. Please don't let it ruin your fun. The other thing is that one of the things that I found, you know, if you ask somebody why they joined the military, you might get a lot of different answers. You know, the patriotism, service, wanted a free education, training, you know, good career prospects, you know, retirement plan. There's all sorts of reasons why you might join the military. But if you ask a science fiction fan that's in the Navy, you'll find that they generally have picked the Navy because of science fiction. I know more than one person, at least two, I think three actually, who've made the observation to me that they chose to be submariners because being on a submarine is the closest thing they could imagine to being on a spaceship. And so that's specifically why they picked submarines. So if you ask a science fiction fan in the Navy, you'll find someone who picked the Navy because of science fiction, and it's usually because of Star Trek. Every time I've asked that question, they've talked about Star Trek. Every time. So Star Trek has a big deal. Star Trek is very much intertwined with the United States Navy, navies in general. Um, Other times, I guess I can think of one instance where somebody didn't say Star Trek and they said Honor Harrington. They said Honor Harrington. That was one of the officers on a destroyer that Bu-9 toured with David Weber in Norfolk one year, and the officer, it was his day off. He came to the ship on his day off, specifically so that he could bring a book for David to sign, and sort of hung around with us for a while, and it was really cool. But that's pretty much what I've got. Let me go real quick through something I've been through before, but it's been a while. So this is a DDG-51 Combat Information Center, and what you're seeing here this is the old version of it. They sort of changed the layout. What you're seeing here is anything that's blue is a chair. Anything that's red is a display, like a computer monitor. Anything that's yellow is like a desk or a keyboard, or it's the part in front of the computer monitor, right? It's the controls in front of the computer monitor. The white things that you see north of one there, you see a couple of screens there, and in front of those screens are some lockers. That's what those two squares are. And then there's a back projection room there where they project on those screens. And that's changed a little bit. They've sort of modified the bridge. I haven't seen. I'm sorry, I said bridge. I meant Combat Information Center. I haven't seen the new layout, but that's pretty much what it looks like. This was specifically done by Winchell Chung, and you see this out on the internet all over the place. This was done by Winchell Chung after I gave him this. And because he was sort of curious as to what all these things were, and so I marked them. And these are the various positions that you have there, and so they break up the warfare problem into a bunch of different stuff, and they have it sort of segregated in different parts of the bridge. I keep saying bridge, I mean Combat Information Center, but this is really my model for what a starship bridge could look like, right? You've got a central display system with the commanding officer and the tactical action officer and the two people that support them sort of in the middle, and then you've got stuff around the outside. And you'll notice that none of those guys around the outside are facing the screens. I like the original bridge, the original Star Trek bridge, better than I like some of the ones that we see in not Deep Space Nine. Deep Space Nine kind of suffers from it somewhat, but like Voyager, right, where they have everybody's facing the main screen. No, there's no reason for everybody to face the main screen. Your job is not to face the main screen. Your job is to be facing the controls in front of you and manipulating that stuff. So I like the original bridge layout on Star Trek because, Uhura wasn't facing the main screen. She was facing her stuff. Now, she didn't really have much in terms of displays, but that's the way that really should be working. You should be working on your thing, not watching TV. I also have a real problem with what they end up showing on the screen. Using that screen as a window doesn't strike me as being very useful at all. Space is dark. If you are sitting in a well-lit room looking out through the picture window at night, you're not seeing anything, and that's what you'd be seeing looking out in space. Now, if Andy Presby were here, he would, at this point, he'd be saying, okay, it just looks like it's being used as a window. It's either it's actually a computerized display, and it's taking sensor data and stuff like that. That's why you sometimes have, in one of the movies, Kirk sees a stealth ship, and it sort of looks like there's a distortion or something like that, and that's a computer artifact that's being generated. And that's all well and good, but there's still a lot better displays that you could be throwing up there, right? There is nothing in the Combat Direction Center of an aircraft carrier or the Combat Information Center of DDG-51 that looks like a window. They don't have the outside view on those screens. What they have is a map display, like a radar display, and you've got tracks on it and stuff like that. One of the, those, if you look where the number 1 is and you go directly to either side, there's 2 small rectangles on either side. Those there that are red. Those are stacks of computer monitors. They're like 5 high, and those are status displays. One of those status displays will have a picture of the flight deck, a live feed from the flight deck, so they can see what the helicopter is doing on the flight deck. There might be one that has a picture of the forward gun. They can change that if they need to. But that's not about seeing what they're seeing on the bridge. It's about what can they be doing when stuff is going on. Like if the helicopter's doing stuff, then it limits what they can tell the ship to do. So it's a much different situation. You're not just seeing people use Windows. And one last picture. So this is what it actually looks like. If we go back, you can see that where it says undersea warfare at the top, there's a top corner of the L. You can see that there's a circle with a little crosshatch in it. That's actually a post of some sort. And that's approximately where this camera is. And so what you're seeing is an enlisted guy whose job is to help run the display. And then to the left of him is the officer who's probably functioning as a tactical action officer. And to the left of him, off camera, is the commanding officer if he's actually in CIC at the time. And then you've got those 2 displays, those 2 big displays in the center, and that's how that looks. Then you've got some smaller displays up top, up high, and then you can see those white on black displays are those stacks of monitors that I talked about. And what you're looking at in that one that's really, really bright on the left-hand side, that's probably the view of the flight deck, and the exposure of the camera just wasn't good enough to get it. And so that's what the bridge, or I keep saying bridge, that's what CIC looks like. And so with that, that's pretty much it for what I've got today. Let me take a quick look in the chat and see if there's anything that it looks like there's a lot of interesting stuff there that we're at an hour. You know what? I think I'm not going to try to go through this. I think I'm going to save it and try to do it tomorrow or the next day. So with that in mind, Pat should be available next week. I'm going to be traveling next week. I'm going to be at my brother's place in Des Moines, so my brother will probably be joining us for the show. Pat's got a presentation that he put together about a game that he played with his friend Chandler. Chandler was on the show, and Chandler's brother Brandon. They went off and they played another one of the war game that Pat's been working up, and so Pat intends to do that. And then the following week, I'm going to try, fingers crossed, I'm going to a science fiction convention. I'm going to Cap Clave in Rockville, Maryland. I'm not going to be presenting. I'm just going to sort of hang out. And I'm going to try to have one of my author friends is going to come on the show and talk about some of the stuff that he's done, specifically Walter Hunt. He wrote the Dark Wing series. Most of his recent stuff has been in the 1632 universe, and he's done some other stuff that was like 1800 science fiction involving mesmerism and an alternate history involving what happens if the colonies don't break away from Britain. But he got started off writing military science fiction that's been republished by Baen. And so we're going to talk a little bit about his universe, I think, from my hotel room, assuming that I have decent capability in my hotel room. We'll see. And with that, good night, everybody. See you later. Now all I need to do is find StreamYard again. And